I told you 1,000 times not to call me like that. I'm still young. Oh? I always forget, it just feels so natural to me. Whatever. More importantly, can you stop following me? You're creepy. But you promised me that you would spend time with me today. You're really persistent, I'll give you that. Why don't you use your dedication to do something else? But fine, I'll do what you say. What did you learn in school today? Oh, we learned how the central security system works in the Law and Citizenship lecture. What did they teach you? They gave us some articles of the rights of the IDAS to memorize. Really? Let's see if you're prepared. What does Article 5 say? Every member has the obligation to wear the official armband of the IDAS of the city on the left arm. It must have the color of the macro section it represents, whenever he is in a public place within the city or on an official mission. IDAs of low level will also have a 1 in Roman numerals marked on the armband, those of medium level a 2, high 3, master and M, unexperienced and E, and Grand Master GM. Bravo, good memory. What does Article 2 say then? In the city, every IDAS must be registered and has the obligation to participate in the military and political life of the city. The higher the rank, the greater the responsibilities? Nope, it's the higher the rank the greater the powers they enjoy. It's easy to remember, the stronger you are, the more powers you have. And how many macro sections are there? 4. Wrong, there are 5, for majors, in which the IDAS are assigned, and 1 subordinated, which consists of the conventional military army. Be careful, it's a common mistake to forget about the subordinated macro section. The sum of these 4 macro sections and the subordinate one forms the central security system. All right, I don't want to ask questions anymore, just tell me Article 1, the most important of all, the one also written in the Senate chamber. The law cannot be the same for everyone. And if they ask you why? Because not all men are equal, some are more powerful and more important than others. Nice. I wanted to give you some advice on what you were studying, but I see you prepared. Now excuse me, but I'm busy. See you another day. Excuse me, but I don't want bits of advice on studies, I want them on fine. You really are annoying. Okay, my advice is...
100 years after the foundation of the city, a guy was walking at a rapid pace through its streets, aware that if he didn't hurry, he would be late. A strong wind had risen just at that moment, a few hours before sunset, hitting his face and sending his hair flying backwards. His clothing was particular. He wore a large leather jacket, with numerous internal and external pockets, under which there was a simple black t-shirt. He also wore army pants, but colored in a very dark green, to the point of being almost black. He was also wearing a simple pair of black sneakers with some white stripes. The guy kept biting his lower lip, showing a slight anxiety, which was compensated by a proud posture, back straight and chest out. He is nothing more and nothing less than the protagonist of this story. He was called Jen Hoffman. He always said that his strange name came from a mispronunciation of the name Jean, but he also claimed, perhaps genuinely or perhaps not, that even he was not aware of why his parents had called him that way. He was a superhuman, a member of the central security system in the other's macro section, high level. To tell the truth, his name was rather well known within the city walls, among the IDAS, for being one of the most insubordinate members, and one of the men least trusted by the central government, and among ordinary men for having ended up many times in the local newspapers for events that in the general picture hardly concerned him, but in which he had to get his hands dirty. He was 31 years old. His appearance was very rough and messy, which was very out of tune with the ambience of order and discipline typical of the city. He had medium-length hair, but it was considered long by the city's standards, and it seemed like many years had passed since they had seen a comb. He was blonde, but his beard color was brown, almost black. His facial lines were very rough and hard, which didn't make him very attractive to women, even though he wasn't an ugly man overall. However, he managed to regain some points in this sense thanks to his eyes. They were as blue as ice, while his gaze was always concentrated, suspicious, distrustful. So, Jan was on the streets of the city, late as usual, while he walked to work. He showed a slight sense of anxiety, since he was repeatedly scratching his cold nose and neurotically licking his bottom lip. This unease, however, contrary to what one might think, was not generated by the possibility of being late for work, but by the fact that, after meeting Sean by chance, a boy of his acquaintance, near the school in his area, he realized that he gave him a piece of quick but bad advice. But what could he do about it? He was surely not capable of being a teacher, and that boy seemed to attach to him, constantly asking him for advice and teachings, like an apprentice Tibetan monk would do with his seniors. He didn't understand why. He didn't consider himself a model to imitate, but he already had decided to help him, and now, he certainly couldn't hold back just because he was overcome by doubts. Sean had asked him for some tips to deal with the tough school life of the city, but, unfortunately for him, his teacher was busy formulating yet another plan to avoid yet another work meeting of his macro section and, to get rid of the boy, he gave him a cheap tip: you must never hide what you feel from others, always say what you think. Be braver. The senses inside Chinese biscuits were deeper than this statement, let alone if it counted as life advice, especially for someone who has a charisma comparable to his sneakers. He feared, considering Sean's apparent weak confidence and his great admiration for him, that sooner or later he might do something risky, prompted by his words. He could find the courage to fight back against his bullies and could risk being beaten up. He could also talk back to his teachers and get in real trouble, or who knows, do something even more stupid. If he gets in trouble, it's not my problem, he kept repeating to himself, while being faithful to his apparent nihilistic and careless nature, but deeper down, he continued to harbor a certain concern for the boy's fate. It's not like he will die, he kept repeating to himself, trying to convince himself that he didn't give a damn. As soon as I see him, I'll tell him to forget what I said, he thought, trying to find a compromise between the part of him that wanted to fix the problem and the one that didn't care. Now I can't think about this, I have to go to work. Speaking of work, Jen hated his and avoided it like it was plague. It was already mentioned that he was constantly late. He was obedient to orders, but he always gave his own convenient interpretation of them, and did as he pleased if they weren't clear. He repeatedly fell asleep at work when he had to perform bureaucratic tasks, most often on his desk with his head over the stack of papers he had to fill out. It must be said, however, that he suffered from narcolepsy. Despite this, thanks to ingenuity, cunning instinct, and a good dose of luck, he had managed to avoid severe punishments. That day, the scheduled meeting he was trying to avoid had turned out to be more important than he thought. It was probably a mission outside the walls, so it couldn't be avoided. Jan very much hoped it was something simple. He was one of the biggest slackers in the entire central security system. While walking, at one point he stepped on a piece of paper. This piqued his interest since usually the streets of the city were extremely clean. When he grabbed it, however, he saw something unexpected, a musical composition. This surprised him even more, but sadly, he had no idea how to read it. There were some lyrics as well in a language he couldn't understand. It was probably Latin-like. It didn't particularly interest him, so he threw the piece of paper away. Finally, he arrived at the building that was his headquarters. It was a grey, gloomy building, like the rest of the buildings after all. All those who worked inside were, as usual, very busy. They moved back and forth, some with papers in their hands, others with boxes. The headquarters of the macro sections were facilities in which there were many individuals with political and military power. They were peculiar places where ordinary men and superhumans coexisted, performing, in some sections, the same functions. It was very easy to distinguish them. Every common man or woman was obliged to wear a dark blue shirt with a white collar, regardless of gender, age, race, or any other distinction. There was also a particular sort of men and women, the so-called black collars, dressed in black shirts, who managed to become the elite of society. They represented what a common human could aspire to be at best in the city. Their role was, most importantly, to be the eyes and ears of the Supreme Commander. The Superhumans, on the other hand, had the right to wear whatever they wanted, no matter the occasion. They often dressed extravagantly or bizarrely even in the workplace, since there was no culture of formality and respect, not even in the field of clothing, because superhumans were entitled to everything. The stronger you were, the more rights you had. It was on this concept that the society of this world was based: strength. Violence was always the correct answer, the only way to control the world. Common people could only obey under the pressure of such an indisputable force. And then there were those armbands on the upper part of their arms. Those damned armbands. These cruel armbands, with their minimalistic style, described the role of each superhuman in the city's society. Their color indicated the macrosection those superhumans belonged to, and the number, in Roman numerals, printed on these armbands indicated the rank of the superhuman. Each macrosection also had a Grand Master who oversaw the entire structure. Those nefarious armbands were the symbol of despotic and unchallengeable power. Jen, then, walked into the facility, looking for someone to ask where the meeting he was supposed to be attending was taking place. A guy, his low-level subordinate, showed him the room, with a tone of respect and fear toward his superior. Our protagonist wasted no more time and set off towards his destination, taking the lift and going up a dozen floors, in a less crowded area. Here the corridors became narrower, and it was possible to hear the rumble of the footsteps of anyone who walked there. The walls were always grey and gloomy. There were no paintings or any other form of decoration. It was the same on all other floors of the building and probably on all floors of all other buildings. Perhaps, the exception was constituted precisely by the floor above this one, where the office of the Grand Master was located, which however, the latter rarely frequented. He then arrived in front of the entrance of the room where the meeting was supposed to happen. There was only an aluminum door, with a red number on it, separating him from the room. He knew that, by entering 40 minutes later than expected, he would, at best, be reprimanded by one of his superiors. To be late in a place like the city was a great shame, but a guy like Jen couldn't care less. He stretched his bones, coughed a little, and, after psychologically preparing himself for the consequences, went inside. In the room, upon first glance, he noticed that there were 5 people, 3 ordinary men, probably no more than some superhuman's lackey, looking around with bored and perplexed expressions, a black collar, probably a strategist, who seemed to be younger than him and showed an impatient and angry posture. Finally, a superhuman, a master to be precise, therefore one of his superiors. Jen knew him very well. It was Shinisuke K2, a surly and diligent high official of this macro section. As soon as they saw him enter, all 5 stared at him with disapproval, but it was clear that it was K2 who was enraged the most. Jen took a few steps, without saying anything, mechanically and slowly. The air they breathed was getting heavier and heavier, and pronouncing simple words seemed like a huge feat. Our protagonist tried to take the initiative and, while awkwardly ignoring them, he tried to sit up and start the meeting normally, but he was soon interrupted.
Don't play dumb, you cretin!
Thundered a furious K2, making Jen shiver and instinctively walk back a few steps. Even the other 4 guys inside the room were intimidated and reacted by immediately sitting down and staying put.
We have been waiting for 40 minutes for you to bring your ass into this room.
He continued.
I hope you have a good reason to explain why you're late. I had a little personal problem, nothing more. You always use the same excuse. By now I've lost count of how many times you've arrived late, or worse, you haven't shown up. Master Kaichu, I'm here now. I'd say we can start. Don't interrupt me. I'm tired of dealing with you and your bullshit. I already gave up on you. You will never change. You had to show up here as soon as possible because this is an external mission that needs to be accomplished as soon as possible, especially before dark. It's pointless explaining all the details of the mission to you. I'm sure you wouldn't listen to us, and besides, there's no much time left before sunset. You can get everything you need in the armory. Everything is written in here. Take this stuff and disappear.
After throwing the mission dossier at him, with Jen barely managing to catch it. Kato walked out of the room and was followed obediently by the other four, while exuding an aura of anger and authority. The truth was that he was more frustrated than angry. He knew that although he had a higher rank than him, Jen always managed to find a way to escape the severe punishments that he wanted to inflict on him. The fact that the latter had never paid excessively for the consequences of his actions, and that the Grand Master was so lenient towards him, remained a mystery. Though Jen had some wit, it often seemed that his superiors feigned blindness. In all other cases, they acted without scruple or mercy, to such an extent that it was quite common to see entire families killed or exiled. Hoffman, indifferent to the situation, read the mission dossier, while continuing to hope for something not too tiring. The date of the paper was March 3, 2071, and the document was from the day before. It described how a particular sound, in quotation marks, similar to a whistle, had suddenly appeared around 250 kilometers further north than the city, within the Maxentius area. It appeared to cover a large area, around 40-50 kilometers. Its nature and origin were unknown, but, presumably, it derived from some psychic power, although it did have mind control-like effects on exposed individuals, something conventional human espers would not be able to do. The reason for such urgency was that there was fear of a possible spread near smaller communities, which were fundamental food suppliers for the sustenance of the huge population of the city thanks to the fertile lands of the north. Among other things, a report was attached to it, and it concerned a mission carried out in the place 3 days earlier, where a member of the Espers macro section and a member of the hand-to-hand one, both of medium level, had given no trace of themselves for more of 72 hours, and were now given for dead or seriously incapacitated. Furthermore, it was written that the mission had to be started immediately after the reading of the dossier. The reason why Hoffman had been chosen for the mission was due to his incredible psychic resistance, which should have been more than sufficient not to suffer the effects of the sound, which it was estimated was probably generated by an Esper. There was nothing else relevant written except good luck. Psychic resistance is the ability of an individual to resist the powers of an Esper of any type. Each object has a certain mental weight, which represents the amount of psychic force necessary for it to be lifted by telekinesis, or the psychic force needed to perform any other action of psychic nature. Humans have a higher psychic resistance than objects, so they can be heavier for espers to lift. For example, a building could be lighter than a person with good psychic resistance. Jen's psychic resistance was so high that no esper could use their powers on himself. It was a trait that every individual had to possess in order to win against an esper, otherwise, the latter would use their telekinesis to make the opponent fly wherever they wanted. The distance between the city and the objective was remarkable. A normal man would not have been able to cover it in a short time. However, Jen, being a high-tier superhuman, possessed a physical strength clearly superior to the standards of ordinary men. Reaching 100 kilometers per hour and maintaining this speed for prolonged periods was not a problem at all. Furthermore, considering the arid and desert landscape of this world, he would have met no obstacles in his way. His abilities, like those of all Idis, were a mystery. It seemed as if he had suddenly developed them at a random moment in his life. In fact, the first job assigned to him was not within the central security system, but was that of a simple doctor who was specializing in psychiatry. During a day of service, however, in the hospital where he was working, a deranged esper, of medium level, whom he was visiting, attempted to hit him, moved by his own schizophrenia. But surprisingly, Jan survived and killed him by sticking a pen in his eye. Not even he believed, before that moment, to be able to fight so effectively, but at that moment he had the feeling that he knew exactly what to do, and he became aware at that very moment of his superhuman reflexes and strength. After this event, he was immediately admitted to the other macro section and began to refine his martial arts techniques and improve his aim. But although he had achieved remarkable results in his job, he was never personally satisfied with his work. After learning his objective, he set off to reach his destination. He then returned to the deserted streets of the city. Soon the sun would set, and there was a night curfew, a rule that prevented any unauthorized person from leaving their home during the night. Although there were numerous streets flanked by sidewalks, there were no cars, as oil was considered a resource too precious to be used by ordinary civilians. In the city, there were only electric trams, which constituted public transport, as well as an efficient metropolitan system. In such a place, crimes were very low because there was no freedom to make mistakes. But can humanity, without free will, still be defined as such? After passing the huge and threatening walls that enclosed the city, our protagonist began to run at a speed comparable to that of a car on the highway of our world, through the desolate landscape of a post-apocalyptic Earth. It was forbidden for an individual to go so fast within the walls, as there was a real risk that they would damage the underlying asphalt or any other surface on which they would step on, as well as being a danger to passers-by. The landscape was getting darker and darker, and he was aware that the dangers at night would increase exponentially. Coincidentally, looking at the deserted landscape, he was reminded of a dialogue he had a long time ago with his guardian shortly after entering the central security system. He was a rookie stuck on the inexperienced level at the time, and although he only held that position for exactly a week before being promoted to medium level, he had time to learn a lot about what he was to expect from then on, and most was taught by the high-level Mora. That for a good period of time a young Jen considered something like a friend as well as a respectable superior, and that was not something to be underestimated, as few superiors had his respect. More or less the dialogue, from what he remembered, went like this.
I just want to give a piece of advice to you. Stay away from the espers macro section and don't face what is bigger than you could pay dearly. I don't know what your problem with espers is, but in case you should meet one, you don't even try to approach them. They are strong, damn strong, and many of them are lunatics, not a nice combination. One of them may end up killing you. Do you really want to die so naively? You are right about one thing, however. Many espers are hard to handle, or as you say, bastards, and it is true that although everyone knows it, no one does anything to counter them, but there is a reason why this happens, and it is the same reason why one must keep away from them. It's their strength. No man has managed to defeat a master-level esper unless it was another esper. If you want to prove their strength, get anyone to tell you stories about the Green Revolt. They are the strongest, and in this world, the strongest always rule.
What Mora had said was true. The highest-ranking politicians within the central government of the city were all of the master, or grand master level, and most of them were espers. They were the strongest, and the strongest, in this world, are almost always in charge. Strength has different faces. We are not just talking about the physical and individual one. Even the charisma and the unity of a group can strengthen an individual or a community. The maximum power in the city is entrusted to the Supreme Commander. This title generally went to the strongest man in the city. At that time the Supreme Commander was also a member of the Esper Macro Section, Grand Master level. Little was known about him, except that he was by far the strongest of the Espers. He intervened only in cases of absolute necessity. He was extremely pragmatic and had been in office since the death of the last Supreme Commander, about 80 years earlier. He was the one to give the contemporary organization to the city and gave power to all his closest collaborators, who were very loyal to his leadership, the so-called black collars. He let them handle the situation, stepping in only when a problem got too big for anyone else to handle. He did intervene an outrageous small number of times, so few that someone had assumed that he was dead and that the central government had kept his death hidden to remain in power and to keep both the population and the most important masters at bay. This rumor was violently refuted during the Green Revolt. Mora's fate was, unfortunately for him, very cruel. He died 2 years after Jen's promotion to medium level. He was accused of engaging in homosexual acts. Homophobia was rampant in the city and, most importantly, there were active laws against homosexuals. To protect his lover and himself from the dreadful interrogations and tortures that would have been placed on him, he took his own life. The hostile environment of this world had taught all its inhabitants that it was necessary to accept reality with all its cruel aspects, even if it was possible to change some of them. Most of the times you just had to resign and surrender. Never give up, nothing is impossible, if you try hard enough, you can do anything, were motivational mottos that were not very popular in this world. Pessimism and resignation were in the everyday moods of the people of this world. The common thought was that there are things we simply can't do. If we want to be happy, we often have to be content with what we have, thinking we could be worse off, and Jen knew this well. The important thing is to be happy, not to do something special to be remembered or praised. The only people we have to like are the ones we care about and ourselves. We don't need to be stupidly ambitious. We don't need to be affected by imaginary problems. We need to live a simple life. This is true happiness, and in life, nothing matters more than it. Jan was thinking of stuff like this during his travel, until he finally managed to reach the destination indicated to him. He absolutely did not fear the possibility that this sound could affect him. He knew all too well how effective his psychic resistance was. However, there was a small problem. He didn't hear this mysterious sound at all. He checked the map and the coordinates given to him several times to make sure that he had reached the place without making any mistakes, but, although he had checked the whole thing several times, he noticed no errors, not by him at least. Furthermore, he had no way of contacting the base. The distance between where he was and the city was too large. The sun had just set and it was getting dark, bloody dark, so dark that if he closed his eyes it would not have made a big difference. Jan then looked for his flashlight in his jacket, but when he tried to turn it on, he failed. Could the batteries have run out? No, he knew he was careless, but he always paid attention when it came to taking care of his equipment. He was completely in the dark. He couldn't see anything. There weren't even stars in the sky to guide him, covered by a thick series of radioactive clouds. He didn't quite know what to do since he couldn't contact the base. The most he could do was go around blindly looking for something. Perhaps it was best to wait until morning, but he didn't particularly relish the prospect of having to stay overnight in a potentially dangerous spot in total darkness. Though his flashlight was gone, his weapons worked perfectly, and Jen would remain a danger even if he fought with his eyes closed. Suddenly, he felt a huge heat hit his torso. It seemed to come from inside his jacket. He hastily checked and noticed how those experimental electronic grenades he'd brought along from the armory were getting hot. It seemed that every device that had even the slightest bit of electronic circuitry was failing. The heat continued to expand, and the grenades overheated. He feared they would explode, ruining his clothes and leaving him in his underwear at best.
That's the last time I trust this futuristic shit,
he yelled, although he was alone, as he hastily and somewhat awkwardly yanked off the straps that held the grenades in the inside pockets of his coat. He collected them all. By now they were so hot that you could cook an egg on them. A normal human being would have been burned by them, but not a superhuman like him. Fearing they would explode in his hand, he threw them away from him and they detonated on impact with the ground, with an explosion that had far more power than a normal frag grenade. The glow of the explosion lit up the whole landscape for a few seconds, and Jen had the opportunity to take a closer look around. But one detail caught his eye. He glimpsed a human figure, to be precise that of a woman, not too far from the place where he had detonated his grenades. He realized that it was highly probable that she had been caught and injured by the explosion. Jen felt a strong pressure on his stomach, accompanied a few seconds later by a sensation. The feeling of his blood freezing. He knew that sensation all too well. It was the sense of guilt for what he just did. Because of his impulsiveness, an innocent person may have lost his life. But something was wrong. The woman hadn't made any sound or shown any reaction to what happened. Why? She wasn't close enough to die immediately. Truthfully, if she had been involved in the explosion, she should have at least heard a scream of panic pain, or at least heard the sound of any kind of reaction, but nothing. It seemed as if nothing had happened. At this point, confused and worried, Jen quickly approached her to figure out what happened and check her condition. He yelled at her not to be afraid of him, that he was there to help her, but he got no response. Perhaps her injuries, shock, or pain had caused her to pass out. No, it wasn't possible. He would surely have heard the thud of her body falling in this surreal silence. He was getting closer and closer, but there were no signs of life from the woman. He came even closer, but nothing. He finally caught up with her, while touching her arm. He asked her if she was all right and if she could see him, but this time as well, he received no answer. He began to think that he was in a state of shock in which every reaction of hers was muffled, which is why he decided to check her heartbeat. It was regular, as if nothing had happened, and he didn't notice any signs of discomfort on her body. He couldn't figure out what the hell was in front of him. He even speculated that she wasn't a human being, but his theories couldn't be confirmed unless he was able to see something. Luckily, so to speak, Jen remembered that a few days ago he had managed to get a pack of cigarettes, although they were strictly forbidden in the city. He had already finished them, but that wasn't the point. The important thing was that he probably still had the lighter in one of his pockets. After spending a few moments rummaging through his pockets, he found it, giving him great satisfaction, which almost in a flash vanished as soon as the light of the fire revealed the face of the woman. Her eyes. They were without pupils. And the woman smiled in a monstrously unnatural way, showing almost all of her teeth. It was not unknown that someone's eyes might have gone completely blank. Some espers had the ability to take over someone else's mind and command them at will as if they were brainless zombies. However, this phenomenon was considered mostly a myth. Even Jen hadn't seen anything like it during his countless missions outside the walls. But even in the myths, a possessed individual is not so unresponsive and passive to the external environment, and, most importantly, they don't smile creepily like that. With difficulty, Jen managed to ignore her disturbing facial expression, and he noticed another disturbing detail. On his left arm she had a green armband, with the 2 in Roman numerals printed on it. She was a member of the Esper's macro section, and, shortly after, he realized that she was the woman who had been sent earlier on this mission by the central security system. It appeared that she had been wounded, but that her wounds had been healed by someone. What brought her to this state, and who had then cured her? The questions to which he could not find answers were innumerable. As Jen pondered on what to do, the woman suddenly started moving and made a huge backward leap. Caught off guard, Jen mistakenly dropped the lighter, but promptly put himself on guard. He was, however, hampered by the same problem, the almost complete blindness caused by this bleak darkness, which severely limited his moves. The wind was suddenly starting to blow harder. This could only mean one thing, that the woman was starting to use her psychic powers. This was confirmed shortly after, as boulders and pieces of rotten wood from the trees that surrounded them began to fly at him. He normally would have been able to handle the situation perfectly, but, as mentioned several times, he was practically fighting with closed eyes, and, to make matters worse, that woman seemed to not be bothered by this problem and could see everything perfectly. At one point, a boulder hit him full on the stomach, taking his breath away. He felt no pain and was not hurt, but he didn't find it pleasant to be hit and be so passive about it. He thought to be stronger and tougher than his opponent, and his judgment could be trusted, being he very good at assessing the strength and ability of his enemies and allies. But experience taught him that things could always go badly. Jen, therefore, decided to change his approach completely. Although he could not see, he could still hear and feel the direction of the wind, as well as the movement of the air. The combination of these factors could allow him to understand, more or less, where those damn boulders came from. From then on, the situation was reversed. Thanks to some good perceptive ability and to the fighting intelligence he developed during his several battles of the past, Jen managed to dodge every single attack, even counterattacking with heavy kicks and strong punches that crumbled those big rocks that seemed, before the power of his legs and his arms, nothing more than thin breadsticks. A few minutes later, he began to get an idea of the woman's position by deducing the direction of the origin of the boulders. By now he seemed to have victory in hand. The only reason he didn't rush to finish the fight was that he had no intention of killing her. He He wanted to make the woman temporarily lose her powers, then capture her. And to do that he had to give her a concussion. The Espers needed full brain health to use their powers. His intention was therefore to hit her on the head, while trying to not hurt her, not hardly, since his super strength could easily kill her. He was preparing a quick dash in her direction that would have overwhelmed her reflexes. His plan, however, was hampered by another unexpected event. He heard footsteps of something heavy. They were loud, like the sound of a drum being violently beaten, and they were getting louder and louder as that something approached behind him. He suddenly turned around and perceived a gigantic figure, about 2.5 meters tall, a large man running rapidly towards him. With his huge hands, he tried with a quick movement of inhuman speed to hit Jen's neck, but he moved so noisily that for Jen, if perceiving those boulders was difficult, sensing this presence was extremely easy. He then easily dodged the attack and backed away quickly, trusting that his own speed was greater than that of the opponent. He soon realized that even though he was faster, the darkness and the Esper woman's attacks slowed him considerably, forcing him to be unable to take the distances he wanted. It didn't take long for him to realize that the man was the other member of the Central Security System sent on a mission that morning. After all, he was about as strong as a medium level. There were numerous questions that Jen couldn't find an answer to, but what tormented him the most was the fact that he didn't understand why those two, who most likely had ended up under the effect of this sound, was still under its control, while, at the same time, he couldn't even hear it. If this sound hadn't occurred nearby, theoretically, even its effects on his colleagues would have had to cease, but he could see with his eyes that this wasn't clearly what was happening. Besides, what kind of beast could possess such power? But now, it didn't matter. He had to think about finding a way to stop both of them without killing them, without being able to see anything, while the opponents, on the other hand, seemed to be able to see in the darkness. The woman continued to bombard him with rocks continuously, while the other chased him like a madman throughout the area in which they were. They were basically forcing him to be constantly on the defensive. For a period, a stalemate arose. The two were unable to hit, let alone hurt, Jen in any way, thanks to his ability to predict their moves and his speed, but, at the same time, he was unable to organize a counterattack in any way, because the slightest wrong movement could cost him a rock in the face or a slap from that big man. The situation remained the same for about 5 minutes, until Jen, tired of all of this, decided to solve the problem the hard way and started facing that giant head-on, attacking him with quick and precise attacks. He always followed the same pattern. He attacked and then retreated, parrying any shots from the Esper, and then cyclically repeating the operation. The reason why he had not taken this action previously was the same that had led him to hesitate and attack against the woman, and that is not wanting to kill his opponents. To be honest, even if he had killed them, in the city he would not have received any reproaches. First of all, because the two were considered dead, and secondly, because they would have been considered nothing more than failures that represent an obstacle to the operation, which is why their elimination would have been justified. However, Jen had never killed any colleagues still on duty, and, despite his troubled morals, he wasn't about to start now. On the battlefield, since Jen was a man of short patience, he changed his approach within minutes, trying to finish it off with one powerful attack. He then lunged at the big man with a mighty leap, hitting both his legs with a powerful kick. Despite the difference in tallness between the two, it was clear that Hoffman was the one who possessed the greater physical strength. His attack was so violent that both of the man's legs snapped like pencils, but what Jen didn't know was that even his opponent still had weapons in his pockets. In particular, he hit exactly where he tied his grenades, exactly the same type as those he had previously. This generated an explosion a few seconds after having inflicted the attack. It illuminated the whole landscape for a moment, pointing out that the man, a member of the hand-to-hand macro section, as it could be deduced from the armband he still had on his arm, had the same disturbing expression as the woman. Although the big man was now almost prevented from using his lower limbs, he, almost as if he were possessed, began to crawl towards Jen's direction with a speed considering the situation, rather rapid. The fight had to come to an end as soon as possible. Although that big man was a superhuman, it seemed that he was pushing his body to the limit to try and chase him. It was not surprising if he had already some broken tendons. There was a risk that his body would shatter. Given his situation, our protagonist deduced that he would not stop until the total stop of brain activities. He had to find a way to make him harmless as soon as possible. By using only brute force, Jen lifted him off the ground and held him above his hand with both his hands. Then, made a huge leap forward into the woman's position. After reaching her, he threw the man's body at her, knocking them both to the ground. A few seconds later, he stood behind the woman and struck her on the head, managing to get the effect of making her momentarily lose her powers and stunning her. After that, almost by magic, the two suddenly stopped moving and lay on the ground, unconscious, but alive. Jen had won the fight. In the man's pockets, Jen finally found a working flashlight and could finally see his surroundings. At this point, Hoffman was again undecided about what to do. He didn't know whether to bring those two poor souls back to the city or whether to continue the mission while searching for something he didn't know blindly. If he had returned with the two who had been given dead, he probably would have been forgiven for the uncertain outcome of the mission, but then sent back here with better preparation and, perhaps, during the day, when he could see something. To prevent further problems, he could invent some lies to make it seem that the withdrawal was forced and that, indeed, he had behaved like a hero by managing to save, despite the enormous difficulties, even those two idiots. The story would have been made more truthful also by his wounds, despite them being just a little bit more than a scratch. No one would have had the courage or the interest to contradict him. At most, he would have gotten a few reproaches from the usual K2. Besides, it didn't make much sense for him to stay there because he didn't know what to do or where to go. All his reasoning led to a single result, to go home, which he actually decided to do. But unfortunately for him, his mission was not over yet.